My name's Ethan. I'm 22, finishing my last semester in the English literature program. Most people think it's all poetry and coffee shop vibes, but there's one thing they don't tell you about being a senior. The university always finds ways to make you earn those final credits. In my case, it was a summer practicum, mandatory library assistance for 2 weeks. Unpaid, of course. Just a quiet punishment wrapped in academic gloss. I wasn't thrilled when I got the assignment. 2 weeks shelving dusty books and assisting confused undergrads who didn't know the alphabet? Not exactly what I'd hoped for after finals. But I showed up the first Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, trying to look half awake in a plain t-shirt and jeans. I wasn't expecting anything memorable. That changed the moment I met Ms. Carver. She was already at the front desk when I arrived. Dark auburn hair tied up in a neat bun, thin gold-framed glasses balanced perfectly on her nose, and a long gray cardigan buttoned tightly over a navy blouse. Everything about her looked precise, sharp, composed. She wasn't cold, but she wasn't warm either, just still, like someone who'd mastered silence. "You must be Ethan," she said without looking up, flipping a page in the logbook. "Yeah, I'm here for the practicum. Clock in at the side desk, then meet me in the back. We have a backlog of periodicals that need to be refiled." That was it. No smile, no welcome speech, just instructions. I clocked in and made my way past the rows of high shelves, the kind that trap heat and dust between them. The university library was older than most of the buildings on campus, and its back sections always smelled like dry paper and something faintly citrusy. Maybe a cleaning solution, maybe her perfume. The archive room was tucked behind a heavy wooden door with a brass handle that squeaked when turned. I stepped inside and froze for a second. She was already there. The room was tight, maybe 10 by 10 feet, lit by a single flickering ceiling panel. Boxes of old literary journals were stacked waist-high in the corners. There was only one chair, and she wasn't using it. Miss Carver stood by a narrow shelf, her back to me, sorting through a stack of bound reviews. The cardigan hugged her figure, and when she turned slightly, I noticed the glint of a necklace beneath the fabric. Simple, silver, delicate. "Start with the stack behind you," she said, still not facing me fully. "Arrange alphabetically by publication, then by year. And be careful with the 1980s journals, the bindings are weak." I nodded, though I wasn't sure she saw it. Her voice had a quiet authority to it. It wasn't loud, but it made you listen. We worked in silence for the first hour. She didn't ask me questions. I didn't offer small talk. The only sounds were the soft thuds of old books landing on the table and the occasional creak of the building settling. Still, I kept watching her out of the corner of my eye. Not because I wanted to, at least not at first, but because there was something about the way she moved. Deliberate, careful, like every gesture mattered. Her sleeves were rolled up to the elbows. Her hands were steady, quick, but graceful. At one point, she knelt to retrieve a box from the bottom shelf. The hem of her cardigan shifted, revealing a glimpse of her blouse clinging tighter than I expected. I turned away quickly. I didn't want her to catch me staring, but she did. When she stood up, she didn't say anything, just looked at me for a moment, eyes steady, unreadable, then turned back to her work. I told myself I imagined that moment, that she wasn't watching me the way I was watching her, that this was just a job. And yet, when I accidentally dropped one of the heavier journals and apologized, she said something I didn't expect. "No one comes back here much during summer," she said, brushing dust off her palms. "Most of the staff avoids this section. Too warm, too cramped, too quiet." I glanced up. "Doesn't bother me," I said, trying to sound casual. She smiled, just barely. "Good." We kept working. By the time the wall clock ticked past noon, The heat in the archive room had crept in deeper. The AC didn't reach this far. I could feel sweat between my shoulders. My shirt clung slightly to my back. She must have felt it too, because that's when she took a breath, stepped toward the center of the room, and said, "We'll stop here for today. It's too hot back here." Her fingers went to the top button of her cardigan, and slowly, deliberately, she began to undo it. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. She kept going, button by button, until the sweater loosened around her arms. Her blouse beneath was fitted, light gray, sleeveless, clean lines. She folded the cardigan neatly over the chair and looked back at me like nothing had happened. "It's better when the air can breathe," she said softly. "Wouldn't you agree?" My throat was dry. "Yeah, I guess so." She didn't smile, just nodded once, then turned back to the shelf. And in that moment, I knew this job wasn't going to be like anything I expected. The next day, I arrived early, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way her fingers moved along each button, about the silence in that room, about the way she spoke low and even like every word was measured. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that she was just being practical, that I was projecting something that wasn't there. Still, I showed up 10 minutes before my shift. The main room of the library was empty except for a student assistant half asleep behind the desk. The lights hummed faintly, and the early sun barely touched the stained glass windows. I made my way to the archive without announcing myself. The door was open this time. She was already there again. Miss Carver stood on a small step stool, reaching for a heavy box on the top shelf. Her hair was in a low bun today, a few strands loose around her neck. She wore a black skirt, a pale blouse tucked in neatly, and that same silver necklace I'd noticed the day before. The cardigan, gone. She heard me and glanced back. "Early riser?" I shrugged. "Didn't sleep much." Her eyes lingered for a second. "The quiet gets in your head, doesn't it?" I didn't know what she meant, but I nodded anyway. She stepped down from the stool and handed me the box without asking. It was heavier than I expected. I nearly dropped it. She caught the edge with one hand, steadying me. "Careful," she said, her hand still touching mine. "These journals are older than both of us." I set the box down and tried not to look directly at her, but I couldn't help it. Her blouse clung slightly to her ribs. The faint curve of her collarbone peeked through the open top button. Her skin looked warm in the dim light. She stepped past me, brushing lightly against my arm. "I need your help today," she said, her voice calm. "We have to reorganize the faculty archives. Professor Grant's papers are misfiled, again." I followed her deeper into the back hallway. We reached a locked side door, one I hadn't noticed before. She pulled out a small brass key from her lanyard and opened it. The room inside was tighter than the main archive, windowless. The walls were lined with shelves packed full of dusty binders, labeled boxes, and handwritten catalog cards. There was no ventilation, just the hum of an old oscillating fan in the corner. She stepped inside, turned to me and said, "Close the door," clicked shut behind me. For the next hour, we worked side by side. She handed me boxes, explained filing codes, pointed out dates, corrected my labeling when I messed up, always gently. But I felt her watching me when I wasn't looking, when I climbed up to reach higher shelves, when I bent down to pick up dropped folders. At one point, I reached for a folder on the top shelf and the entire stack above it shifted. A few binders came loose and tumbled downward. She caught one midair. The other hit the floor with a soft slap. I cursed under my breath. She laughed. "Careful," she said. "You're going to bury me alive back here." "I'll dig you out," I replied before I could stop myself. Our eyes met, and for the first time she didn't look away. A long, suspended moment passed between us. The air in the room felt thicker. Her eyes weren't amused, they were searching, calculating. "I'll hold you to that," she said finally, her voice low. I bent to retrieve the folders. When I stood back up, she was closer than before. She reached past me for a box, her arm brushing against my side. I held my breath. "You smell like books and sunlight," she murmured absently, almost to herself. I said nothing. She straightened slowly, eyes flicking over me briefly, chin, shoulders, throat, then settling back on the shelves. The moment passed. We continued working, but the rhythm had changed. She no longer gave instructions. We moved in sync. When I passed her a box, our fingers touched. When she brushed dust from a label, her palm lingered a second too long. And then came the silence. That loaded silence. She stood behind me while I filed a row of faculty newsletters. I could feel her presence, close, still, steady. Her breath near my shoulder. "You're surprisingly good at this," she said, barely above a whisper. "At filing. At focus," she replied. I turned slowly. She wasn't smiling. She looked at me like she was seeing something she hadn't expected. Not a student, not a helper, just a man in front of her. "You keep looking at me," she said. I didn't deny it. She took a step closer. "Do you always stare at people you work with?" "Only when I'm not sure if they're real," I said. That made her pause. Just slightly. Then, softly, she said, "I'm very real, Ethan." I opened my mouth to respond. But just then, the fan clicked loudly and began to spin again, slicing the moment clean in half. She stepped back. "Take a break," she said, back in her usual tone. "You're sweating." I wiped my forehead. She was right. My shirt was sticking to my back again. The room had grown hotter. She walked toward the single chair by the door and sat down, crossing one leg over the other. The hem of her skirt slid up just enough to reveal the pale line above her knee. She tilted her head and looked at me, steady. "Too hot back here," she said again, quieter this time. And just like yesterday, her fingers went to the top of her blouse. Not the cardigan this time, but the effect was the same. Slow, controlled, intentional. She didn't look away as she unfastened the top button. Then the second. The collar loosened, revealing the base of her throat and just a shadow of skin beneath. "I'll finish this section," she said, eyes still on mine. "Go cool off." I stood there for a second too long, then nodded, stepped outside, and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking. The third day, I didn't even pretend I wasn't thinking about her. I woke up too early, drank my coffee too fast, changed shirts twice. It wasn't nerves, it was anticipation. Something had shifted yesterday, and we both felt it. That room, that heat, the way she looked at me and didn't blink. It wasn't in my head. The door to the archive room was closed when I arrived. The student assistant at the main desk didn't seem to notice me walk in, earbuds in and head down. The library was nearly empty again. No one had classes this early in the summer. I knocked twice on the door. No answer. I turned the knob slowly. The archive was dim, lit only by a desk lamp in the corner. The ceiling light was off, making the space feel more enclosed than usual. Miss Carver was standing at the far end of the room, flipping through a stack of handwritten catalog cards. She looked up when I entered. "You're early again," she said. "You didn't lock the door." Her mouth curved slightly. "Didn't think I needed to." There was something different in the air. Heavier, slower, like we'd stepped into a frame of silence. I moved toward the center of the room and set my bag down beside the table. She didn't give me instructions today. Didn't hand me a clipboard or a box. Instead, she walked over to the far side of the desk and sat on its edge, facing me. "I'm not used to company back here," she said, folding her arms gently across her chest. "Most of the student assistants avoid this part of the building." "Because it's hot," I said. She nodded. "And because I don't exactly invite conversation." "You invited me," I said quietly. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "Did I?" "You didn't ask me to leave." That made her smile, but not fully. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers moved slowly, thoughtfully, over the buttons of her cardigan. I didn't realize until that moment that she was wearing it again. A dark one this time, thinner, fitted. It clung to her sleeves and wrapped softly around her waist. "You know," she said, "people always assume librarians are boring. Books, silence, rules." I replied. She nodded again, slowly. "But books have teeth. Some of them bite when you least expect it." She was still looking down when she said it, her thumb tracing one button. Then, without warning, she unfastened the top one. Then the next. Her eyes lifted to mine. "You're staring again," she said. "I can't help it." "I know." The third button came undone. The soft knit fabric parted slightly at her collarbone. Her breathing was calm, controlled. Her voice didn't rise or falter. "It's too hot back here," she said again. "You'd think after all these years they'd fix the ventilation." She let the cardigan slide off her shoulders, slow and deliberate. It pooled around her elbows as she leaned back on her hands, letting the air settle against her skin. She wasn't wearing anything dramatic underneath, just a fitted black tank top, ribbed cotton, modest but close to the body. But on her it felt intimate, more real than silk, more deliberate than lace. I stood frozen, my hands on the edge of the table, heart loud in my ears. She didn't move, didn't ask me to sit, didn't smile, just watched. "Do you know how many students have worked here in the last 5 years?" she asked. "No, 17. You're the only one who's ever asked me a personal question." "I didn't ask anything." "You didn't have to." Silence pressed against the room like humidity. She pushed herself off the desk, standing in front of me now, closer than we'd ever been. Her eyes were level with mine. Her voice was quiet, but not hesitant. "I used to think quiet places were safer," she said, "but they're just louder inside." My throat was dry. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you listen." We stood there, still, like the walls might close in if we moved too quickly. Then she reached past me, barely, and turned off the desk lamp. The room darkened. Soft golden light leaked from the hallway under the door, but everything else went dim. She didn't step back. Neither did I. Her hand hovered for a second, brushing the side of my wrist. Then she whispered, "You should probably leave now, Ethan." "I don't want to," I said. "I know." She didn't say anything after that. She just turned away, walked back to the desk, and picked up a manila folder like nothing had happened. Her back was to me now, posture perfect, cardigan slipping halfway off one arm. The moment was over, but it wasn't gone. I stepped back toward the door. My hand rested on the knob, but I looked over my shoulder before leaving. She didn't turn around, but her voice followed me anyway. "Same time tomorrow." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with the fan buzzing weakly above me, the open window doing nothing to cool the air, and her voice repeating in my head like a skipping record. "Same time tomorrow." She hadn't touched me, hadn't kissed me, hadn't said anything she couldn't deny. But something between us had changed. Not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. The next morning, I walked slower than usual through the library hall. Part of me was afraid she wouldn't be there, that the weight of yesterday had scared her off, or worse, that I had imagined it all. Misread her eyes, her body language, her voice. But the door to the archive was open, and she was there. The lights were on this time. The fan was running. A stack of fresh folders waited at the sorting table. Ms. Carver wore a high-necked blouse, sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, her cardigan folded across the back of her chair. Professional, composed, untouchable. She didn't look at me when I walked in. For the first half hour, we worked in silence. No glances, no tension, no comments. It was like we'd reset. I started to convince myself that she regretted it, that the heat of the room had made things blurry, that this was her way of putting walls back up. Then, as I reached for a folder near her elbow, her hand brushed mine, just slightly. She didn't look at me, just said, "Be careful with that one. It's fragile." She didn't mean the paper. We worked until noon. She gave no indication that anything had happened between us. But every now and then, she'd pause, linger a second too long at the shelf, let her fingers rest lightly on the spine of a book, or tilt her head in that same thoughtful way. When I gathered my things to leave, she finally spoke. "Ethan." I turned. She didn't stand, didn't move, just looked at me across the dim room and said, "I'll be in the reading annex tomorrow. It's quieter." I nodded. "Do you want me to come help?" She waited just a beat too long. "Yes," she said, "if you'd like." That night, I dreamed in flashes. Paper, sweat, her fingers on buttons, her eyes in the dark. The next day, the annex was locked when I arrived. I knocked once, quietly. She opened the door without a word, stepped aside to let me in, and locked it behind us. There were no stacks of books, no filing to do, just her brown leather satchel on the desk, and 2 glasses of cold water already sweating in the heat. She handed me one. I took it without speaking. "It's always hotter in here," she said, her voice level. "I'm okay with that." She nodded, then sat in the old velvet chair near the window. The sunlight hit her hair, picking up hints of auburn I hadn't noticed before. She didn't make a move, didn't play coy. She simply said, "So, what now?" I sat across from her, the heavy air settling around us. And for once, there were no distractions, no work, no noise, no performance, just silence, the kind you don't want to break. She looked at me, eyes quiet but clear. "Do you want me to stop?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I want to understand." She nodded again, then leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, hands folded. "I've spent most of my life behind other people's words," she said, "in margins, in archives, in silence. But sometimes, someone looks at you and sees past all that." My heart beat louder in the stillness. "I saw you," I said. She let that settle. Then she stood, crossed the room. And this time, when she stood in front of me, she didn't ask anything. She just watched. And I understood everything. Later, I left the annex without looking back. The hallway was empty. The sun outside had shifted slightly, hotter, brighter. But something in me felt cooler, still, solid. I didn't know what would happen next. Maybe she'd pretend again. Maybe I would. But as I reached the main door of the library, a slip of paper was already tucked into my back pocket. In her handwriting, small and sharp, "Tuesday, 3:15. Archives." No signature, no explanation. But I didn't need one.